And then Riley just joined us too.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's nice because it does offer you
I know.
opportunity for your audience and more people to be able to participate. So how many, if we have 8 participants, you want them like in groups of 4? Oh, you want 2 per person? Do you want? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I suspect probably that. We were out earlier, so we have some.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation over bacteriophage therapy. Really appreciate that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joey. I'm a 6th-year student here at the University of Findlay. I'm on my academic rotation with Dr. O over there. And I have the pleasure of getting to do this for you guys. So without further ado, let's kind of get started, jump into the objectives. So we're going to go over what exactly a bacteriophage, or as I like to call it, a phage, is. We're going to get to discuss the history of phage therapy. We're going to go over why we actually use it and why it's very, very good for multi-drug resistant organisms in particular. We're going to delve into different case trials, compassionate use trials, see how it's being used today, and then we're going to ponder the future of this drug therapy. So when we start here, we're going to have to start with antimicrobial resistance. So this is going to occur because of an overuse of antibiotics or inappropriate use of antibiotics. When we give these antibiotics to patients, what happens is these bacteria will end up evolving, mutating, changing. So that way they can end up resisting the antibiotics that we are using to take them out. You know, simple Darwinism, survival of the fittest. So they're going to evolve to not die to these antibiotics. And this becomes a problem because we start having less effective drugs to be able to treat these infections. Infections can spread easier, they're more difficult to treat, and it really has become a global crisis. So worldwide, there has been about 5 million deaths that are associated with this antimicrobial resistance. And on top of that, about 1/4 of those are actually directly attributed to the antimicrobial resistance. So it's not also just happening, you know, worldwide in Africa, Asia. It's happening right here in the United States, right here in Ohio. We use antibiotics all the time. The more you use antibiotics, the more likely you are to have a population that succumbs to antimicrobial resistance. So if you go through diseases, injuries, and risk factors back in 2019, if antimicrobial resistance was actually included, it would have been the 3rd leading cause of death. So it's something that's growing. It's something that's not going away. Not only that, but we don't have as many antibiotics being produced today. So the antibiotics that we have that were working are no longer working new ones at the rate that we once did. This is causing a major global threat. So the consequence of continuously using these antibiotics repetitively, inappropriately, and all of that leads to pan-resistant organisms. Now, that should be something that relatively scares you guys. That means that we have a bacteria that we don't have drugs to be able to treat. Take a second and think about, you know, a mother, a father, someone you really, really care about, and they're in the hospital, and the doctor tells you, we don't have antibiotics to be able to treat this infection. That's scary. It really is. But fortunately, this is where we get to introduce phage therapy, where we use bacteriophages to treat these bacterial infections. And because of this antimicrobial resistance, we have renewed interests in phage therapy. But what exactly is a phage? So a phage is actually a virus, and it's only going to target bacterial cells. It doesn't target any eukaryotic cells. So no human cells, no animal cells, nothing along those lines. But the good news is they're found everywhere, right? In soil, in feces, in sewage, in water. So they're incredibly plentiful. There's quite literally billions among billions of them on Earth in every biome, right? So here I have the actual depiction of what a bacteriophage looks like. So from the bottom up, we have the spikes and the tail fibers, which help them attach to the bacteria. we have the tail, which contains the collar and the sheath. That allows the actual penetration into the bacteria itself. And then we have the capsid head, which contains all of the DNA of the bacteriophage itself. So now we get to move on to the actual lytic cycle of the phage. So the first thing that the phage has to be able to do is recognize the bacteria that it's trying to attack, right? So it's going to recognize it by some protein or antigen or something along those lines on the outside of the bacteria. It's then going to use those tail fibers to stick to it. Once it does that, the sheath is able to then poke a hole basically within the bacteria itself. After that, it can inject its DNA within the bacteria. That DNA will integrate with the bacterial DNA, and it'll begin to replicate. It'll go through transcription, translation, make all of these different proteins and such, to where we are now able to produce the more bacteriophages without the bacteriophage actually having to do anything. It really hijacks the cell itself to produce more bacteriophages. Once we have enough of these, they're going to assemble, and they're actually going to burst out of the bacteria themselves, and that's how they replicate. They kill the bacteria by bursting it, and it releases more bacteriophages into the actual surrounding areas. So my first thought, maybe this is something that's occurring to you guys as well, is, hasn't somebody thought of this before? I mean, they don't target human cells, they only target bacterial cells, so they got to be relatively safe, right? And for me, I was like, this is silly. Why hasn't nobody done this before? I didn't know about this until about a month ago. Well, it turns out all the way back in the 1800s, we had our first case of bacteriophage likely discovery, where there was a guy named Ernest Hankin, who was a biologist, and he was looking at Indian rivers, and he found that there was actually something in there that was destroying cholera-inducing, or bacteria that induce cholera. That's a better way of phrasing that. 20 years later, we have two more gentlemen, Frederick Twort, and I'm going to butcher this name, Felix de Herelle, who also note this principle that's happening, where these bacteria are breaking down into granules, and our good guy Felix up there, he's the one who actually coins the term bacteriophage. 2 years later, we actually get to see our first use of phage therapy in a child with dysentery, and this child was actually cured of dysentery, which is very impressive considering a lot of these phages are found in very unclean areas, and I'm sure back then the way of purifying them was not the greatest, but it worked, and that was really, really cool to see. It's not until about 30 years later where it really starts to become mainstream in the Western world, where Eli Lilly, a big drug manufacturing company, is able to commercially produce these bacteriophages. However, the reason we don't see bacteriophages now is because at the same time, antibiotics were becoming very prevalent. Antimicrobial resistance wasn't a thing back then because antibiotics weren't around as long. They didn't have the time to evolve and mutate. And so bacteria were very much susceptible to these antibiotics, and it was the way to go. So over the next couple of decades, every once in a while, you'll see a country use them for something. We see Germany using them for dysentery. Russia in the 90s and 80s ended up using them for a couple of things as well. But really, it ended up halting up until 2017, where the quote-unquote rediscovery of phage therapy has begun due to this antimicrobial resistance. So how do we go about actually obtaining these things? Well, the first step is just going out, grabbing the actual environmental sample, right? Soil, water, feces, and being able to obtain phages that way. After we actually obtain them, we have to go about finding out how to purify them, how to amplify them, right? Because there's not going to be enough in a specific, sample. We have to purify it. We have to amplify the amount of them there. After that, we're going to go through different titers, DNA sequences, endotoxin screenings, and quantifications, because like I said before, if we're finding these things in sewage, feces, these relatively gross places, we're going to want to make sure there's no endotoxins in there. Don't want to, inject that into your veins. It's really, really bad. So after that, they'll go on work alongside with antibiotic synergy trials. So they'll put them along different antibiotics to see, hey, does this help the antibiotic somehow? Who knows? After that, they'll go on to storage testing, more endotoxin screening, and sterility testing. And finally, after they say, okay, we have a phage we think is good, then they're going to put in something like a phage bank. You can think of a phage bank almost like a community pharmacy or a retail phages, right? It's a place where they can hold a whole bunch of these drugs, these phages, to where if they need them to ship them out or to give them to somebody who is there, they can do that. It's a storage place for them. So in terms of selecting phages, really what we have to do is we have to look at the specific patient, right? The patient's going to have some sort of bacterial isolate that whatever they're growing, we're going to have to plate that. And then we're going to put a whole bunch of different phages on these separate plates. And we're going to look for the plaques. Now, these plaques are all of those holes that are on that plate there. The more of those there are and the larger they are, shows the efficacy of the phage itself. So that's how we know which one to select. And this takes a lot of time. It takes a couple of weeks, but overall, it allows us to know which phage or phages might be best for treatments. So here I have kind of my first question here for you guys. Select all of the following true statements. So I'm going to allow you guys to kind of sit down and discuss these things. The first one, phages don't target human cells. They only target bacterial, fungal, and parasitic cells. 2, to work, phages hijack the cell, incorporating their DNA into that of the targeted organism. 3, phages are commonly found in sewage, water, and soil. And 4, phages are a recent discovery for the purpose of treating infections, with the first clinical use of phage therapy in 2017. I'm gonna let y'all talk about that for about a minute or so. I'll be right back.
So it doesn't do. Zoom. You know what? I think we have to do it on the computer. I'm gonna put this back. Now these are gone. Oh my God. Here we go. Is this sharing? There it goes. All right, so going back to the first statement, we're just going to do a show of hands or whatnot. Phages do not target human cells. They only target bacterial, fungal, and parasitic cells. Who thinks that's true? All right, so not quite, actually. It was a bit of a trick one here. So they only target bacterial cells. They don't do anything for parasitic cells. They don't do anything for fungal cells. That was kind of a mean one. They don't target human cells, but they're not going to target fungal and parasitic cells as well. 2, to work, phages hijack the cell, incorporating their DNA into that of the targeted organism. True? Yeah, that one's true. 3, phages are commonly found in sewage, water, and soil. Is that true? Yep, that one's true. And then the last one here, phages are a recent discovery for the purpose of treating infections, with the first clinical use of phage therapy in 2017. Is that one true? Y'all are good. Good stuff. Yep. Back in the 1800s is when that first started, and the first case was actually in 1919. All right, so what's actually happening right now in terms of the research into phage therapy? Well, because these aren't FDA approved or anything along those lines, we really only have limited clinical trials, and most of the trials themselves are compassionate use trials. So we usually look to specific one patients and look at each of those cases to draw a bigger conclusion at this point. So the best type of patient is going to be somebody with a single organism bacterial infection. That's because a lot of these phages are specifically designed to target one type of bacteria. And so if they have multiple types of bacteria, it becomes an issue because we might clear out one of them, but who's to say the other one's not going to run even more rampant after we clear that one out? Secondly, we want to reserve these for patients where antibiotic therapy has failed. Right? Antibiotics are still the first line. We don't want somebody who can have a drug, who has a bacterial infection that can be treated with something simple like amoxicillin or penicillin, to be getting a treatment such as this one that isn't FDA approved. We don't have, incredibly reliable data quite yet. And finally, we need patients who are stable. I'm going to talk about this one a little bit later, but right now you just need to know they're stable because it takes a long time from when a patient elects to receive phage therapy to when they actually obtain it. So we have a ton of different uses for phage therapy at this point. We have respiratory tract infections for patients who have cystic fibrosis, infections with devices that aren't able to be removed, osteomyelitis or infections of the bone, because these actually penetrate bones as well. We can use it for GI tract infections, urinary tract infections with various organisms, even extended spectrum beta-lactamase organisms, which are just very, very resistant organisms. And then really the over-encompassing thing here are going to be multi-drug resistant organisms. That's what MDRO is. And recurrent infections. Drugs are infections that for whatever reason we can't treat, or they just keep coming back even after multiple treatments. So how do we go about dosing these things? Well, they aren't dosed in milliliters or milligrams or grams or anything that we commonly see. They're actually dosed in something called plaque forming units, which refers back to those plaques or holes that we saw within the actual agar plates there. So the standard dose is going to be 10 to the 9 PFUs. However, we don't really know what the optimal number of phages at a particular site is needed. So that needs more research. However, we do have a dosing target, and it's called the multiplicity of infection. And we want that to be at least 10. So what that means is if we have 10 phages that attach to a specific bacteria, we have a multiplicity of infection of 10 because 10 are able to connect to the actual bacteria themselves. When that happens, we start to see a higher transduction efficiency. Now, transduction efficiency, all of that means is these phages are able to get in, incorporate into the DNA, and actually exert their mechanism through that lytic phase that we talked about earlier. So the higher that MOI, the higher that transduction efficiency, the higher the supposed effectiveness of the phage therapy in itself. Now, there are a whole bunch of different studies out there that suggests multiplicity of infection lower than 10 is with clinical failure. But we can see we can even get down to a multiplicity of like 1.2, and it still should be relatively 70% efficacious. Now, it's not a one-to-one saying, okay, if I have a transduction efficiency of 70%, that it's going to be 70% effective, but they are correlated, whereas the higher one number goes, the higher the other number goes. And this does change from phage to phage, bacteria to bacteria. So we can't just look at one phage, look at the MOI and say, okay, that's going to apply for every phage out there for every bacterium. It's going to differ from one thing to another. So now moving on to frequency and duration of therapy. We don't know. It's something that we still have to learn. We still have to do research into. They've looked at every 6 hours, every 8 hours, every 12 hours, and every 24-hour dosings pretty regularly. And what they've noticed is that, much like with antibiotics, it's going to differ based on the phage and the organism that they're treating. So every 6 hours might work for one, where every 12 hours might work for another. Duration is something that they really don't know, but it's dependent on their clinical response. Usually the starting point is going to be whatever we would have treated them with antibiotics, that duration. We start with that, and then we kind of go from there. But what we have seen with phage therapy is most, roughly 80 to 90% of the beneficial effects of phage therapy are seen within the first 7 days. But we can't alter that depending on the patient's response. So how do we give these things? Well, the most common route is going to be IV. And the reason where we want to do IV is because we're able to bypass a lot of the metabolism, a lot of the gut, the liver. It's able to get straight into the blood and go wherever it needs to be. So it has a lot of fast absorption. Faster absorption than intraparenteral, intramuscular, or subcutaneous. But there are other options we can use. We can take it by mouth, for example, but then we have to start wondering about, okay, is the gut going to destroy it? Is the liver going to metabolize it? What's going to happen there? It's probably going to require higher doses, which might mean more adverse effects. That's why we tend to stick with IV. But we do see them in some GI infections, specifically Clostridoides difficile. Then we also have a few other niche routes of administration here. We have inhalation, which can be used in a couple of different respiratory tract infections to go straight to the lungs. And then we can also apply bacteriophages topically in some cases to biofilms as well. So there are plenty of different ways we can actually give these bacteriophages. So a lot of the times we can use a single phage, but most times, if possible, we're going to try to use a phage cocktail. Now,
A phage cocktail is just a combination of more than one phage. Both of these, the usage is going to be determined pretty much by availability. Do we have multiple phages that work against this organism? How fast can we get them to you? All of that. But the reason why we would want to use a phage cocktail is because with single phages, it might lead to phage bacterial resistance, which is similar to antibiotic resistance, but bacteria can also evolve to resist phages. When we have multiple phages, it makes it more difficult because there's multiple mechanisms that this bacteria now has to try to mutate to be able to overcome what is being presented to them. Right. For the most part, we're going to be administering these alongside antibiotics. And for a single phage, we're always going to administer them alongside antibiotics. And when we use multiple phages in the same phage cocktail, we want to try to make sure that they attack different receptors. Because if they're attacking the same thing, it's just going to be competition between the same phages. And the additive benefits aren't going to be nearly as good as if we were going to just use one that targets one receptor and one that targets another. So are these things safe? This is something that crossed my mind because I'm like, we're using viruses to fight bacteria. Like, isn't there a risk for like viral infection? It did not roll over. There we go. All right. So the good news is because these don't actually infect human cells, we have a really, really low adverse effect profile, lower than that of antibiotics. And really what we've seen is that most of the side effects that have occurred are really transient side effects from endotoxins that weren't 100% cleared out through the purification process. So it's really, really nice to see that this new type of therapy really doesn't come with many side effects. Granted, there needs to be a lot more research because we only have a couple of case studies, a couple of compassionate use trials that have gone on within the past, 6 years or so. But we have enough to where we can say there hasn't been many side effects, which is really, really nice. So I have my next question here for you. Which phage therapy regimen would be the most optimal in a patient with pan-resistant Acinetobacter baumannii in the GI tract? All you have to know about the Acinetobacter baumannii is that it's a very resistant organism for the purpose of this question. So feel free to discuss amongst yourselves for a little while.
What do you think? Second one. I think it's second. I was thinking third. Since it's in the GI, we should probably go wrong.
What? Yeah.
Unison. It's all back there. It's all back there. What's the other one? So we just learned this.
All right. Well, kind of bringing it back here. Hopefully you guys have got an idea because the answer is we don't know. Amazing, right? Isn't that a great answer? So we don't know, but the thing is we can infer what probably will be the most effective, right? I would say we probably wouldn't do one because most antibiotics aren't given as a one-time dose, for example, and usually we need concentrations to kind of build up. And they've only really been studied when used, every 6, every 12 hours or so. So one dose probably isn't going to be enough there. We also know that IV tends to be better than IM in terms of rates of absorption and things along those lines. So we're probably going to stick away from the IM. My personal opinion is I would go with 2, 3, or 5 because it is in the GI tract. So who knows, something oral might be able to exert its mechanism there. As long as we can make sure it's not metabolized by the gut or anything like that. But we could always use IV. Whether 7 days or 14 days, that's something that the physician is going to have to be able to talk with some phage specialist about. And they're going to have to communicate because, like I said, we don't know. But it's really great how we're able to go through and discuss these things because I honestly believe phage therapy is something that's going to be pretty big in the future. So where exactly is it being done? Well, the United States is pretty much leading the charge right now. Specifically in California, the University of California has an actual center for phage applications. It's called IPAP, and they're really leading the charge here in the U.S. Now, there's other places, Texas A&M, Baylor, Yale. They also have colleges of medicine that are really working on phage therapy and optimizing it, building these phage banks for people. And it isn't just the United States. We also have China and Germany and Russia. They're all really, really helping out in terms of developing these phages. Every once in a while, you will see the UK there, and even less often, you'll see other countries such as France and Spain. I've seen a couple of studies from, but it really is being done all over the world right now. All right, so there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to go through all of this text. I dropped off different packets and stuff like that, so hopefully you guys can pass those around or whatnot. But all of this to say that the patient's timeline to actually obtaining the bacteriophages from when they say, I want bacteriophage treatment, it takes about 10 weeks. I talked earlier how we want our patients to be stable. This is the reason why. It takes a very, very long time to actually obtain these phages because they have to agree to take on the case. They have to be able to send all of these agars and plates to the phage specialists. They have to test which one is better. They have to go through IND applications. They have to go through IRB applications. And once everything is approved, they can finally send the bacteriophages to the hospital the patient's being treated at. And it's a really long and messy process. It can be as short as 5 weeks I've seen, and the longest I think I've seen is 17 weeks. And this is even if they can identify a phage that works to attack the bacteria that the patient's suffering from. There is a chance that we're not going to be able to find a phage because, again, this is a relatively new thing. So who knows if we're going to have something to be able to treat these patients at this point. As the phage bank grows, we're going to see more organisms that can be targeted, but at this point, it is relatively limited. So now I get to move on to some clinical successes. Now these are provided by Dr. Andrew Gainey. He's a pharmacist and he's also a pediatrician, and he's really leading a lot of what's going on here in terms of phage therapy in the recent era, I guess. So first person, we have the 17-year-old female who had end-stage renal disease due to chronic interstitial nephritis. She received a transplant 4 years ago and has been suffering from a lot of urosepsis. If you guys can see there, she had 3 different urosepsis pretty much in a row. All of them were the blood and the urine were testing positive for extended spectrum beta-lactamase E. coli, which is just a really, really resistant E. coli. And so they started with ertapenem treatment, which is a broad spectrum antibiotic. They started for that with 10 days. It came back. They did it for 14 days. It came back again. They did it for 28 days. Okay, well, next up, they had pyelonephritis, which is another UTI, where her urine again tested positive for this ESBL E. coli. And she also had a Clostridioides difficile infection on top of that. So she was once again treated for that. And then all of that happens, by the way, in the span of 5 months for this lady. So she's on antibiotics for more than half the time within this 5-month period. And she can't be doing super great on them. Finally, she has her 4th urosepsis, where again, her blood and urine come back positive for this ESBL E. coli. She has treatment with ceftazidime avibactam, which is another broad spectrum antibiotic, for 4 weeks. Then she goes back to the ertapenem for about 12 weeks. And then finally, she's able to obtain phage therapy. And she does that alongside the ertapenem for 21 days. So what actually happened? Well, they used those phages that I'm not going to try to pronounce, IV daily for a total of 21 days at that standard dose that we talked about earlier, right? And the first 3 days, they actually overlapped this phage therapy with the ertapenem here. So if we look at the outcomes here, it took 10 weeks to actually obtain this phage treatment, which is pretty standard. There weren't any adverse effects. Awesome, awesome. But the really great things is that we saw the urine cultures 5 months after this treatment. They showed no growth of any organisms, really. And 5 years into the future, which was reported, I think, in 2022, she had no ESBL E. coli. She was constantly getting bombarded with this organism over and over again. I mean, 5 different cases of this ESBL E. coli within the past 5 months. And then she went 5 years, nothing there. It pretty much eradicated the organism from her. This is the power of phage therapy, and I think it's really, really cool to see. But that's just one case. Let's look at another one. There we go. What about a patient with cystic fibrosis? There's a 10-year-old boy who was colonized with a chromobacter. Again, just a very hardy organism. That's all you really need to know from that. And he had this for 4 years prior to phage therapy. He was suffering from this organism living in his respiratory tract. He didn't meet traditional criteria for cystic fibrosis treatment, and we saw that his FEV1 ended up declining. Now, for those of you who don't know what FEV1 is, it's basically just a measure of respiratory function. The closer it is to 100%, the better you're doing. The lower it is, obviously, the worse. So he was already low to begin with, probably due to the cystic fibrosis and the infection, but it kept declining all the way down to 33%. So clearly he was not breathing well, and this is just a 10-year-old kid. He shouldn't have to go through this stuff. But he was given some phage therapy alongside some meropenem, vaborbactam, and cefiderocol, 2 antibiotics that are, again, very, very broad spectrum. And there are actually 2 different courses given. One where they were given side by side to each other, and one where they were given staggered to one another. And here's what they found out. So they found no adverse effects, once again, awesome to see. But 7 months after his second treatment, his FEV1 was up to 76%, better than when he presented to the hospital. On top of that, 4 years afterwards, there weren't any Chromobacter isolates obtained. They were gone. His hospital admissions for any lung-related issues, nothing there either. This kid is able to live as close to a normal life as possible now because he doesn't have to live with this bacterial infection that's been plaguing him for 4 years. And that's awesome. That's really great. So now I get to move on to what the future of phage therapy is. So for now, I want you guys to look at the left-hand side here. This is what I'm going to call the 1960s bacteria before antibiotics came in. So we have our normal bacteria, and it has something called an efflux pump. Now, efflux pumps, for those of you who don't know, basically just pump out things from inside the bacteria to the outside of the bacteria. So one example of something it might pump out is an antibiotic because the bacteria does not like antibiotics. So back in the 1960s, there weren't many of these efflux pumps, and they weren't super efficient because they didn't have to evolve that way. So even though they were there, they weren't effective enough to clear out the antibiotic. And so there was a good amount of drug accumulation and death as a result. But as we've gone forward through time, these bacteria have mutated. They've overexpressed these pumps, and now there's so many, and they're so effective that when we give an antibiotic, now there's not enough drug within the bacteria itself to be able to actually kill the organism in a lot of cases. Maybe it can, maybe it doesn't, but there's a lot of cell resistance. So my question that I thought of was, what if we find some sort of bacteriophage that's able to target that pump? Well, firstly, it's going to be a great target because they've been overexpressed, right? Secondly, they'll be able to bind, insert their DNA, go through the whole lytic phage, burst the cell, cure the infection. Yes, but there's more. And this is why I think phage therapy is really cool. So now that these bacteriophages are targeting these efflux pumps, the bacteria is going to go, oh my gosh, I'm being killed because of my efflux pumps. These efflux pumps, I have to get rid of them because they're the reason why I am dying. So evolution and mutation, all that stuff is going to take place just like it did previously. And the bacteria might go back to where they only have very few efflux pumps. Well, guys, now those antibiotics that we once used, they can work again. They're not being pumped out. Now, this is just one mechanism of resistance that I'm using as an example. But these are some of the things that we can try to consider with phage therapy. There are some really, really great outcomes that can happen. And there are endless different types of possibilities here. So I'm going to turn it to you guys for a couple of minutes before we end up getting to questions for myself or whatnot. But talk amongst yourselves. What do you guys think about phage therapy? Here's a couple of questions to kind of guide your conversations, but talk about it for a minute. I'm curious. I'm going to be walking around. Oh yeah, for those of you who are online, we're going to be putting you guys in breakout rooms, so you guys can talk as well there.
It's probably more expensive. Also, very curious what it looks like with yeah, when it comes to insurance coverage. Oh yeah. Depending on how the research and I got yes, well, remote regulation. I've been thinking about that. Or wait a that would be the way to do it. I want to huh. I like that solution to the problem of drug resistance.
Yeah, that's like that's
Right now, I'm on a rabbit hole in West right now that I can't get out of right now. So,
and you just figured it
stuff
out.
I'm thinking somewhere well, I want to like.
Hey guys, real quick, I just want to make note. I'm going to be sending around a sheet. Just put your name in there, just so we know that you came and stuff like that. We can give you credit. So keep talking.
No, you may not. Yeah, I should. Maybe. Nope. No, I gotta go back. Like I did the vaccine. I don't know what's clever.
That is weird. It doesn't count for that.
Or maybe it was carrier. Or I think I got clever.
Probably.
That's right.
Yeah, I would have got yeah, that would make more sense.
It didn't show up.
I'm not gonna go.
It is what it is.
But there's like, I think a few estimates like, technically, it's I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought I was like real horrible. I just didn't do it.
I see.
All right, guys, we're gonna kind of bring it back here. Last part here, beyond references and stuff like that, is I wanted to open it up to if you guys had any specific questions that I could possibly answer or clear up for you. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns with this, so I might not be able to answer them, but hopefully I can give at least some direction. Yeah. That's me. It's possible that we could develop something with phage resistance. That's why we want to use, when we use phages, multiple phages at the same time, because that limits the amount of phage resistance. Sigma phage, it's a funny term. But it is possible. Once we start using phage therapy, we might see certain bacteria develop phage resistance, and that could coincide with antibiotic resistance. At this point, it's only being used for like recurrent and multi. As antibiotics are. So I don't expect it to be nearly as prevalent in the phage therapy at this point. Good question, though. Thank you. Anybody else have anything?
Based on just your research and everything, what do you think that phage therapy is going to be like a regular thing in like how many years?
Gosh, that's a good question, because getting phage therapy FDA approved has proven to be very, very difficult. Despite the case trials that we have right now, there's not enough research at this point to even try to attempt it. I would say probably in about 5 to 10 years, we could start to see different FDA approvals possibly start at that point. I wouldn't expect until about 2040 for it to start to become mainstream in terms of treatment in these multi-drug resistant organisms. But that's honestly just a guess at this point. Yeah.
Did any of your research show like the estimated price point for patients for getting one of these therapies?
Yeah, so it was roughly like $8,000 to $20,000 or whatnot, which it's expensive, but we also have to remember there's only like 4 places in the United States that are actually doing this right now. Very new, very novel. The good news is, since phages are everywhere, to be able to actually obtain them isn't difficult. And once we build that phage bank and are able to refine our ways of being able to purify them, remove the endotoxins, I do think that price is going to go drastically down. All right. Is there any report of resistance? At this point, I didn't find any reports of resistance. I do know from the IPATH website, they said that 83% of their attempted phage therapies resulted in success. So 83% success rate for the most resistant of drugs in terms of antibiotics. But in terms of phage resistance, I don't think the data is quite there yet. All right. Well, if that's it, thank you guys again. Make sure to sign the sign-in sheet. I think that's still being passed around or whatnot, but just so you get credit, and hopefully you enjoy it.
Thank you all for attending.